Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to continue, or indeed begin in earnest, a discussion of the primary works that are featured on this amazing set that was released by the Criterion Collection earlier this year. The set focuses in on the filmmaker and artist who is Marlon Riggs. And the name of the set is The Signifyin Works of Marlon Riggs. This is fascinating, amazing, and it has a number of supplements, but also has the works that are part of the primary feature of this particular set. And so I'd like to focus in on each of these works over the course of these video discussions, if that's okay with you. And that brings us to the first of such featured works, which is from 1986, and it is described often as being a documentary or a type of documentary. It's just shy of 1 hour, so a little bit less than 1 hour in terms of its running time. It is very powerful indeed. It is called Ethnic Notions, and it is from 1986. Ethnic Notions is a documentary that, in essence, presents a very powerful message and statement and argument, which I think could be described in its essence as throughout various forms of media, such as literature and cartoons and storybooks and music and film and cinema and stage performance, traveling shows, as well as, say, articles of marketing and caricatures used for trademark and promotion and advertising, etc., throughout various forms of media and media representation in the United States, since, say, stemming back to the period, the antebellum pre-Civil War period of the United States. From this era to, say, the beginning of the 20th century, and indeed into the latter half of the 20th century. So throughout many years in the United States, in these various forms of media representation, there have been a number of very damaging and degrading and harmful racial-based stereotypes and caricatures focusing in on the depiction of African American people, of black people in these, as I say, damaging and harmful stereotypical caricature fashions. And so this film focuses in on, say, the history and origins, or what could be said to be the origins and reasons behind the start of these particular caricatures. And indeed, there are many types of forms of these caricatures, these racial-based stereotypes that have been developed over time. And there are some subtle differences between these, or among the various stereotypes that are at the focus of this. And so there are also, the argument suggests, there are also a lot of, say, historical context-based reasons that could be said to be the reasons for these various forms of stereotypes to have come about. And also there are some societal concerns, as well as some other investigations and explorations as to the root cause and nature of these various stereotypes, and indeed why they are harmful. And so the focus, therefore, of this work, Ethnic Notions from 1986, is, I would say, this type of statement, or this exploration. Now, what Marlon Riggs and company do in the course of this film, in exploring this particular notion, indeed, is he relies upon various forms of media themselves, because that's part of the argument, right? That these caricatures and racial stereotypes have existed throughout various forms. And so that's what he does. And he goes, I think, in a very carefully thought out and planned a methodical approach, following a general course of history, a almost linear trajectory, starting in a sense with general statements that lead to specific or citing of specific examples that come from the slavery period of the United States in the antebellum period prior to the Civil War and post-Civil War and Reconstruction, etc. And so, and the discussion is also reliant on a number of people, experts who are being interviewed from various fields of expertise, from the entertainment field to performance to social media criticisms to academia and history. And so from various areas and literature, etc. And so from various areas we get a number of experts who give us further items and points of statement in order to, again, further the discussion forward regarding the history and origin of these racial stereotypes, the effects of these racial stereotypes, and how they have, changed over time, and what are the reasons for those changes. So, for instance, the general, I think, argument further posited by people like Larry Levine and Barbara Christian are that these caricatures, seem to be a result not just of the people making the caricatures, the creators of these caricatures, but also the result of the society that seems to be absorbing and consuming these caricatures. So that could be a sign, according to Larry Levine, of perhaps a viewpoint on race and African Americans, not just on the point of view of the people making these, but also from the point of view of the people receiving these. And so that seems to be, in essence, a type of inherent commentary, which is also carried over by Barbara Christian, who says, I think, a very, very powerful point, which is, if these caricatures are perpetuated over time, then the consequences of these racial caricatures can be immense and very significant indeed, to be very psychologically damaging, not just in terms of how people view African Americans, but also how African Americans view themselves. And so she says, if we are seen that way, this is Barbara Christian speaking, if we are seen that way, then we begin to believe it ourselves. And so these are the damaging consequences of the long-term aspects, or even short-term aspects, if you will, of these types of caricatures. And so this sets the stage for, I think, a very thorough and quite convincing type of engagement and discussion of history, beginning with, for example, the image or the racial stereotype that seems to be suggesting a type of maybe lower intelligence and a type of maybe low intelligent complacency to a certain situation. And so this type of stereotype seems to be coming about, the argument set suggests, in particular in the antebellum or pre-Civil War period, which, and is in particular in the South, although it's not only in the South, in the United States, as many of these scholars suggest. But the argument tends to be that this type of complacent image of a racial stereotype of the African American person is coming in a period which also coincides with the systematic application of slavery in the United States, again prior to the Civil War in the 1800s. And so what this seems to suggest to many of these scholars is that this type of racial stereotype is damaging because it is trying to promote the notion that indeed African Americans are complacent and perhaps even content in this system of slavery that is being imposed upon them. And so therefore the racial stereotype forms a type of psychological damaging effect, because it means that it prevents any type of social movement towards protecting these people who are the subjects of this very terrible system of slavery. And so it prevents that type of movement from type of mobilizing in social spheres and atmospheres. And also it means too, as a psychological effect, and this goes back to what Barbara Christian was saying earlier in the documentary, that perhaps if these caricatures are perpetuated enough, that means that it has a really impactful psychological effect on people themselves, and so people begin to view themselves in this way, and so that is a very terrible consequence. And then this leads into a discussion of the origins of what is described as being the entertainment based upon Ethiopian delineators, and this then becomes, or it's referred to under a different term or form. This is called the minstrel show. And what this is the origins is the discussion of T.D. Rice and how T.D. Rice saw a particular person, an African-American man, I think, doing a dance. It's described here as a Jim Crow dance, and Lenny Sloan, and one of the speakers, also talks at length in great detail about this. And seeing this, T.D. Rice takes this and uses this to create this show of what becomes the minstrel show, and to almost appropriate and then to adapt it for purposes of what becomes the minstrel show. And this becomes very popular. And this also is shown in the North. For instance, Lenny Sloan says that the T.D. Rice shows in Ohio, which is in the northern part of the United States, they were very popular. And for many people who were attending these, who saw T.D. Rice, was essentially one of the first minstrel show performers, a white performer performing in blackface. This was, for a lot of people, according to Lenny Sloan, one of the only ways to receive and to get images of African Americans. And so if this is the only way for people, or one of the only ways for people, audiences, to get these images, then this becomes a very damaging, or potentially damaging, aspect of these types of racial caricatures. Again, here focusing in on the minstrel show aspect and the origins of this. And it became this very popular thing that, and in particular in the North, according to Lenny Sloan. And so this also perpetuates other racial stereotypes, in particular in the North. This coincides too with the Civil War and then the post-Civil War Reconstruction phase. In terms of the so-called in terms of political and social context, or I should say political context, freedom granted to those who were otherwise subjected to slavery prior to the Civil War. And so what this leads to is yet another sort of transformation, according to the documentary, of the stereotype. And this leads to now the stereotype of the African American person who is trying to be accepted in high society, but seemingly failing along the way, and thus becomes the target of jokes, becomes the butt of a lot of the jokes and the humor. And so people laugh at this particular person who seems to be otherwise wanting to rise in society, in wealth and class, but seemingly not being able to, because this person looks like a buffoon. And so that is the racial stereotype that is being perpetuated in this period, or one of the racial stereotypes, again, after the Civil War. And so what this means is, after the Civil War, when you have the potential for, say, social mobility and freedom, at this point, at this juncture, then a racial stereotype, and indeed Lenny Sloan reminds us that it also existed in the North, and various shows and entertainment venues that were very popular in the North as well. This type of racial stereotype then essentially contradicts and even perhaps potentially damages any type of forward momentum movement that, say, the social and political change post-Civil War would have otherwise had. And so this is another way in which the racial stereotype has been changed or transformed to otherwise meet certain aspects of the moment of history, or the particular moment in time. So there was a certain stereotype that were prevalent prior to the Civil War, and now immediate post-Civil War, there seemed to be an emergence of new altered stereotypes as well that are, according to the documentary and the academic scholars, as equally as damaging as any stereotype that might have existed earlier. And also the prevalence of these through new forms of media and entertainment, such as the emergence of what is now known as the minstrel show. And then we go into these other forms of stereotypes as well that are carried into early, or that are we see carried over into early 20th century art forms like films. And we have the focus on what is known as the mammy stereotype, and this is a female servant who is according to a number of the scholars, who is not depicted in terms of she's depicted in a type of, say, a servant mode only, as a type of figure that is taking care of certain or everything in terms of the household in which she is employed, and then also dealing with certain social issues that arise vis-a-vis the family who are part of that household. And so this also is then maybe a return, if you will, or a type of example of how you have various types of stereotypes at the same time doing similar things. And so if you have this quote-unquote mammy stereotype, again, this is using the verbiage of the film itself, then what this is too is a further maybe attempt or a further stereotype that could be said to be, quote-unquote, a defense of slavery or a defense of these modes of subjugation. And especially because this particular character, or these caricatures, are seen to be very happy, even when they're in this particular mode of servitude. So, and then traveling through the course of history of this documentary, then the documentary turns towards the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century, where we have, and as we know, and as those who are history students know, during this period as well, there were very sharp and strong divides with respect to race and race relations. For example, the issue of miscegenation comes up, and perhaps coinciding with these social upheaval aspects of history, we have the emergence or the reemergence of the racial stereotype, again according to the film, of the savage, of the brute, of the black man who is dangerous. And that type of very damaging racial stereotype becomes further perpetuated, again coinciding, according to the documentary, coinciding with this particular part of history. And this leads to further forms or further examples of this this racial caricature in various forms of entertainment that become very popular. For example, the Thomas Dixon work, The Klansman, which then becomes the basis for the film The Birth of a Nation, which becomes a huge, huge hit, this huge popular hit. But of course, there are within those works and the film very damning and damaging caricatures of the African American person, of the man, as this evil caricature, or these evil characters, and so these savage characters threatening people, which is very much, again, further perpetuation of these harmful stereotypes. And so it also seems to be coinciding again with these trends in history, and perhaps also to the argument is further laid down that maybe in a subtle or subconscious way or subconscious effort, the establishment of these types of damaging racial stereotypes might then be support, or might lead people to think that ultimately the results of emancipation that resulted at the end of the Civil War in the United States, the results of emancipation might have been a mistake. And so that becomes yet another very harmful, or at least potentially very harmful, way in which these caricatures have consequence. And so this is very powerfully presented in this work. And so and this is also discussed in the film in the context of World War I, or at the start of the 20th century, and how even though we had soldiers and people in the military who were faithfully serving their country, who were African American soldiers, and they were faithfully serving their country, there were still images of the soldiers, say in films of the time, etc., where they were seen in aspects of servitude, serving the other white soldiers, etc., in the particular troop or unit. And that sort of image is perpetuated further. Again, servitude, even though they are serving their country, and indeed they're giving what could be the greatest sacrifice to their country, which is their own lives and their own being, in order to fight for this cause of the World War I. And so despite this type of hope, and again, a lot of the scholars here say and remind us that this period gave a number of young African American people a lot of hope, because perhaps they saw this as a chance to become accepted, and yet at the same time these chances were thwarted, or they were dashed, and they were destroyed, because again the stereotypes were continually being purported or being perpetuated. So this also leads to a further discussion of other types of stereotypes as well, other types of caricatures that were equally as damaging and damning. For instance, focusing in on young African American children, the stereotype being perpetuated is that they were maybe subhuman or savage or some other type of really damaging form of perspective. And so this is perpetuated too in cartoons and caricatures and other pictographs, etc. And also coming back to the idea of performance and returning to a discussion of the minstrel show, what becomes a focus of a lot of popular entertainment throughout this course of the earlier 20th century is the idea of the black performer having to perform in blackface, because that would be something that such performer would be able to sell tickets for. And the really cruel irony is that such a performer is not asked to, say, perform the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar or James Weldon Johnson or Gloria Douglas Johnson, according to the scholar Carlton Moss. No, these performers, these black performers, would be expected to perform very degrading and humiliating performances of blackface, of the minstrel show. And so that points to yet another cruel type of irony that is part of the overall, say, narrative, if you will, that's being posited here. So this, what is referred to also by Lenny Sloan as a type of catch-22, at the minstrel show dilemma. And this further perpetuates the stereotype as well. And the story then turns to a discussion of Bert Williams. And Bert Williams, who is one of these artists, who is a black man and performer, who is doing the imitation of blackface. So he is a black man performer who gains a lot of popularity because of his blackface minstrel performances. And so there is one of the very cruel, ironic aspects of this type of discussion. And Lenny Sloan, who is one of the participants of this documentary, he is also an artist, and one of his comments here is that he wants to complete or sort of celebrate and recognize the importance of the legacy of an artist like Bert Williams. And so what Lenny Sloan then does is there is a performance within the documentary itself of Lenny Sloan performing Bert Williams backstage. And at first he is speaking to us, the camera, and talking about the psychological impact, or artistically expressing what must have been the psychological impact of this type of show time and time again on the performer Bert Williams. And then it takes a very powerful turn. And Lenny Sloan, in character as Bert Williams, turns, but doesn't turn to us, looks at us through the reflection in the mirror. And so he's looking at us through the reflection, but he's also therefore looking at himself. And he's talking to himself, and he says, and he says in this beautifully timed performance by Lenny Sloan, again as Bert Williams, the real-life Bert Williams. This serves as a type of eulogy to Bert, according to Lenny Sloan. There's a moment that's so powerful where he breaks down and he says, almost a type of admission, "It's no disgrace being a black man, but it's terribly inconvenient." This is one of the most powerful moments in this work, Ethnic Notions, and indeed a work that is powerful throughout. It is powerful throughout, but here's an example of that power and how Marlon Riggs is really using not just citations and quotations to various forms of media. He's actually incorporating a performance itself, a live performance, as it were, within the bounds of the documentary. So this is a very far-reaching and a very almost experimental type of documentary filmmaking or video making style on the part of Marlon Riggs, and I applaud him for this, as many other people have done in the past, quite rightly so, right? Quite rightly so. And here also showcasing the performance, the strengths of Lenny Sloan, and also his expertise. And also, as Lenny Sloan says, this is a type of eulogy and acknowledgement of the legacy of artists like Bert Williams. Again, that catch-22, that cruel irony that artists like Bert, or many other artists like him, had to face during these times in order to essentially, what they were doing was they had to perpetuate these terrible stereotypes, because that was the only way they could make a living. And they had to make a living. They had to, put food on the table. What else could they do? And so that is the discussion that is being had here. And then going forward, then it then turns to a more detailed discussion of, say, 20th century art forms. Cinema is brought about. The advent of sound brings about the very famous announcement of Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer. And so this leads yet to another further discussion of racial stereotypes, this time in cinema or sound cinema. There's also discussion of another caricature in early cinema, in early American cinema, that's Stepin Fetchit, the Stepin Fetchit character as well, and how these are yet again further perpetuations and links to these racial stereotypes that have existed for many, many years, since prior to the Civil War. And they're just being adapted or changed for the changing times. And also these are further perpetuated not just in works of cinema, but also in cartoons that are also targeting various audiences, especially young audiences during the day. And they're finding further, say, avenues and routes of distribution, and more people are beginning to see it, thus making these racial stereotypes all the more damaging. The more people see them, the more damaging they become. And they become very damaging by virtue of the fact that they are so prominent and so shown over time that they become almost, or the argument goes that they become accepted, and they become funny, and they become aspects that people can nonchalantly and innocently laugh at. And that becomes part of the danger. That becomes a crucial part of the danger, I should say, of racial stereotypes like these, which is that over time, if they become accepted, then they have they have really done a significant amount of damage. And that is one of the strong points of reminder that this film brings up. Notions of the mind are affected. Ethnic notions, I think that's the link to the title as well. And this also is perpetuated, as I was indicating earlier, in terms of forms of advertisement and media and collectibles, and the way that the African continent is depicted in a lot of these images as well. Again, links to or perpetuating the notion or the stereotype of the savage, of the brute, of the subhuman. And so these are further presented over time. And then even as the film ends, there is a commentary about how the argument is that maybe these stereotypes exist even in modern forms of cinema. And what's referred to as the blaxploitation period of cinema itself, for example, how these perhaps do contain or include the modern day equivalents of these various forms of stereotypes as well. And so one has to be wary of what one is watching, the type of information that one as a consumer is consuming. Again, that is the point or argument or statement that the film ends on. And indeed, we should say, too, as a type of summary, and the film summarizes this very well, that the argument here about the perpetuation of such damaging racial stereotypes seems to come in various subgroups or subcategories. And this is what the film says. These racial stereotypes are damaging because they perpetuate the notion that, one, black is ugly, 2, blacks are savages, and 3, blacks are happy servants. And so the perpetuation of these very damaging and harmful notions becomes what is at the very heart of why these caricatures and the consequences of these caricatures are so damaging the way they are. And indeed, they seem to coincide with history, although one of the ways that this film does end is a discussion of how, say, the civil rights movement that took shape in particular in the 1960s in the United States, how these movements seem also to really run counter to the otherwise established narrative of these racial stereotypes. In other words, taking the stereotype of blacks are happy servants. If we take the stereotype of blacks are happy servants, then what this means is that the civil rights movement is running completely counter to that type of narrative. In other words, there is no sense of complacency. There is no sense of happiness in this form of servitude. On the contrary, there is a sense of wanting to have a further establishment and acknowledgement of political and social rights that breaks breaks these particular harmful stereotypes, or at least breaks the perception that these stereotypes are indeed what they are, and perhaps shows us as consumers that there is indeed a much different picture than what is being otherwise represented in these caricature or representations. So this is, I think, in essence, a very powerful work because of these points, and it is focusing on topics that might be described as quite sensitive and maybe very complex. They're also very important and very much in need of a lot of discussion and a lot of thought and consideration. And I think in the hands of Marlon Riggs and company and the great discussions that are had and contained in the interviews, as well as the reliance on various forms of media, both that are cited and quoted, but also that are performed and contained within the work itself. This is an overall dynamic, powerful, and fascinating work from the artist Marlon Riggs. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.